Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Bleed Blue podcast. This is going to be episode 5. It's pretty much the podcast where I talk about everything Evil Geniuses, and you guys also get to see the growth of my facial hair over the past couple of weeks because I have not shaved. Um, but no, we have a lot to cover in this week's episode. A lot of things have happened across multiple esports, which is great because it means finally we get to have this podcast where I kind of want it to be, where we're talking about multiple esports. We're not just only focusing on Counter Strike. We can talk about League of Legends and Valorant and Counter Strike and eventually Rocket League and Dota 2, and we can really just kind of talk about everything all at once. And I think that's kind of what my end goal for this is to be, and hopefully as I cover these teams more often, I'll start to gain a bit of a knowledge base. I'll try to be obviously watching the matches, and so maybe I'll even get to, as an added bonus, be able to understand watching other esports a little bit better. Whereas right now, I feel like I'm mainly comfortable with Counter Strike, Valorant, League of Legends, and Rocket League. Um, and even in League of Legends, I'm not massively experienced. I've been watching for a decent amount of time, and Evil Genius is relatively new to the space in League of Legends, so it hasn't been as difficult as to kind of go over those topics, um, you know, so far. But we'll see, and hopefully this is something that can continue. But the reason why I say there's a lot to talk about, just to kind of give a quick overview, we've got League of Legends Worlds plans that is starting this week, and some announcements regarding the roster, like I predicted last week. Which we'll get into. Valorant just announced their franchising, so we'll be able to talk about Valorant franchising. And then after that, it's pretty much all CSGO related, and there's a lot of CSGO content to go over. I'm going to touch on the other, I don't want to call them smaller teams, but the secondary rosters. Even the female team. I'm going to talk about the female team very briefly. Give them a shout out. Also have EG White and EG Black. I'm not really going to go over the naming thing too much. I don't really think it's that big of a deal. Teams have been naming their teams. Cloud9 Blue, Cloud9 White. This is a very common thing. I don't really see it as much of a point, but I'll probably briefly I guess I'll just get it out of the way now. I think it's stupid that people are really like making a big fuss over it. It's just one more thing to bash EG about, but it's not really that big of a deal. That's all I'm going to say about that. But we're going to be talking about the EG Black team, the EG White team, the female team. We're going to be talking about this is a big topic that I want to get to cover because I feel like it's come up quite consistently in discussions, and it's something I want to delve deeper into. Um, which is the Blueprint project. We're going to be talking about that as a whole. We're going to be talking about, what do I think it's doing well? What do I think it's not doing well? Where do I see the project? What do I see this project doing, in the future? What are the plans for each roster? What is the coaching staff structure like? What can I speculate on? But then also, what do I think is the best way for this project to go in terms of like, okay, if we take this project at its value, what are the plans for this roster? What is the end goal, right? Um, and then we're also obviously going to talk about the main roster. ESO Pro League Group D has just completed today, so we have a lot to talk about regarding Evil Genius's main roster and ESO Pro League. So without further ado, let's jump straight in to our very first topic, which is, of course, let me put here, League of Legends Worlds. The Worlds plans is going to begin this week. It starts on Thursday, which is pretty exciting. I'm not going to lie. And for those who do not know, right, to kind of set the scene, EG in the LCS finals took third place in a close series against 100 Thieves, which meant that they are going to have to play in the play-in stage rather than just immediately qualifying for the group stage of Worlds. And so this is why they are playing this week. There are two groups in the play-in stage, and then the top two teams from each group play in a little, or I think they play in a four-team. I believe it's a four-team like playoff stage. I can't seem to pull up the specifics, but if I remember correctly, correct me if I'm wrong, but I'm pretty sure the way it works is it is the top two teams from each group play in a 4-team playoff bracket, and the top two, or actually it might be that may just determine seeding. I know they go into a playoff bracket. What I'm not aware of, I've been trying to find it. I haven't had too much success. I can't recall if, let's see here. This year, 12 teams will participate in the play-in stage, with the top 4 advancing to the group stage of Worlds. So it looks like all 4 teams go to, all 4 teams will go to the top. The top 2 from each group will go into the group stage. But I'm pretty sure the little playoff stage will determine the seeding going into groups. So obviously, you want to make sure that you get the best possible seed. And and I guess to kind of the first thing I'll do is I'll just kind of say, did EG get lucky in their play-in stage selection? Yes, they did. There were 5 teams that are pretty comfortable to say will most likely or were contenders to make it out of the play-in stage, or that are contenders to make it out of the play-in stage. Those teams are Fnatic, Evil Geniuses, RNG, Royal Never Give Up, DRX, and Mad Lions. And out of those 5 teams, that got split up into 2 different groups, EG got placed in the group that only has one other contender in their group, which means, because it's only 4 teams are going to move on, obviously that means one of the contender teams to make group stage will not make group stage. And so it was kind of a big toss up. You just didn't want to be in the group that put you with the group where you have 2 other contenders in your group, because then most likely, if you're Evil Geniuses, you're probably one of the weakest. You're vying for that weakest contender spot. So you just don't want to be put in that group of 3, because the chances of you getting third and not making it are very high. And luckily for Evil Geniuses, they ended up being in Group A, where they only have Fnatic that is going to be kind of a threat, in their group. And so EG did get lucky in that respect. It looks like they have a good chance of making the group stage of Worlds. It's not guaranteed, but they have a good chance, right? So hopefully that is what happens. But the big news that I predicted last week was that we would finally figure out if Danny was going to be coming back to the roster, or if Kaori was going to be used for Worlds. And I can't recall if I mentioned it, but I said I thought I said I was pretty sure that Kaori was going to stay in the roster, and it looks like that is the case. Kaori is going to be in for Worlds. It got announced a couple days ago, if not yesterday. And by yesterday, guys, again, that means Saturday. I'm recording this on Sunday evening. Yeah, Kaori is going to be in for Worlds. I think this is a good thing for 2 reasons. First, I'm going to go with the more human element of it, which is obviously that I don't want Danny rushing back in to his first Worlds if his mental health isn't in the right place, right? That's something you would never want. No fan would ever want to see one of their star players coming back, not in the right mental condition and perform poorly, in their first ever big Worlds event. Yes, he played MSI, but this is Worlds, right? This is the biggest tournament in the world. Of the year essentially. You don't want a player coming back in who isn't mentally stable, right? Or isn't on the right, mental. They're not in the right mental headspace, right? So I think this is a good thing for that reason. I think Kaori is also a good. It's also going to be good that Kaori is in the roster. And I need to stop saying that. I need to say Kaori, because I'm pretty sure that is the pronunciation for it. So I'm going to try my best to say Kaori, but it's going to be difficult because I'm so used to saying Kaori. But Kaori is his champion pool and his style, I think, is quite a quite nice change of pace. Plus, his champion pool is just better for this meta. Assuming that the world's meta does not change, I hope it doesn't for Kaori's sake, because Kaori just seems to have a really good. His champion pool is really good for this meta. And so I think it's actually going to make Evil Geniuses really strong. They've obviously been practicing with him. So this is no longer like it's just a substitute, like give him some slack, it's a substitute. No. they've had time to practice with him. This should be good, right? We should see a better EG here than we did against 100 Thieves, right? Ideally. So I actually like this a lot from both the competitive and the human element aspect. Obviously, I would love nothing more than for Danny to be healthy and be playing in his first Worlds after he's just had such an amazing career already. But when you think about the mental perspective, and then you look at the fact that Danny was just getting abused. He was getting abused in terms of the champion picks. You could tell he was getting abused in lane. People were targeting him. They were making sure that they essentially didn't have to worry about the AD carry lane, and could kind of just use that weakness in EG to kind of just ruin anything that they were trying to do, right? And Yeah, so overall, that's all I have to say. I think about League of Legends in the sense of I'm looking forward to the playing stage. The matches will be played at a reasonable time since they're in NA, which will be nice for a change. Typically, the world's matches are usually pretty tough to watch otherwise. But it looks like it's going to be hopefully a good playing stage. Hopefully, no upsets from like DFM or I don't know, some of these other teams, right? Hopefully that doesn't happen. Hopefully EG ends up making it through the play-in stage and going into groups, right? Which I can't really speculate on which group they'll get placed into, but that's something that we can talk about in a week's time when the play-in stage has ended. So yeah, all right, let's move on to Valorant. And let's see if I can. Probably not going to be able to fit that. We'll just go with Valorant. How about that? We'll just say Valorant. And the reason why we're going to be talking about Valorant, even though there are no competitive matches going on right now for Valorant, is because the 30, I believe it was 30 teams got announced. Yep, 30 franchise teams were announced, 12 of which are for the Americas region, and Evil Geniuses ended up getting one of the 5 slots to make franchising in NA, or for Americas, for the Americas. Or, well, one of the 5 spots for North America in the Americas VCT, um, you know, uh, new franchise league, right? Um, and so this is a big deal. EG's been working for this for quite some time. I got the sense that this was something that was a very strenuous process, and that Riot were really you know taking their time and being very harsh on which teams made it and which teams didn't. And I get the sense that this was a very stressful experience for every player, for every team owner, for everyone involved. It must have been extremely stressful. And so my heart goes out to everyone who is making this happen. Allowing EG to make it into franchising because it's such a big deal, right? But with the news of EG making franchising and seeing all the awesome videos from Evil Geniuses and from Nicole Lapointe, who was doing who was making videos, and that you got to see like the reaction of the players and content creators for making franchising, which is really cool to watch if you haven't. But A lot of people were saying they didn't really understand why Evil Geniuses was selected. They thought that Evil Geniuses is not that good of an organization, not that good of a team, and they don't really understand why they made it over other organizations like Optic, for example, was the one that got thrown out a lot. Um, Maybe some other organizations like TSM, right? FaZe Clan, G2, although with the recent news of what's been going on with G2, people didn't really bring G2 up as much because it was so up in your face, blatantly obvious why they weren't selected. Um, you know, but those other orgs, people were saying, Evil Geniuses, they're not even that good. Why did they even get, you know what I mean? I have a real problem with this. I don't really understand how people can take that perspective. I think Evil Geniuses has just become such a love to hate um, type of organization, which I wouldn't mind nearly as badly if they had the fans to support them, which I just don't think Evil Geniuses have a massive fan base, which is sad. Um, if they did, I wouldn't mind this kind of label that they've earned because I think it actually goes really well with the brand, right? Live evil, that whole thing. I hope if people just love to hate you, even though you really haven't done anything wrong in Valorant. Um, I can see some benefits to that from a marketing standpoint. But I think I just don't understand it because people aren't looking at the details of how teams were selected, and they're just going off of results. Results were not taken into account in Riot's decision. They literally posted the criteria for their decision making in an article, and they explicitly say that the performance of teams had nothing to do with who made it and who didn't. And I guess the other organizations, I'm sorry, I'm kind of backtracking here, but the other organizations that people said were shocked that didn't make it were the Guard and XSET. Um, I think when you take into consideration that results did not play any factor into the decision making process, I think it's pretty obvious to see why XSET and the Guard didn't make it. They're very, very small brands. They are pretty much only well known in Valorant. So it makes sense that they probably wouldn't get the slot, right? Um, so those are the reasons about those. But it comes down to a multitude of factors, right? Not only does it come down to the fact that Evil Geniuses has not only have they worked with Riot in the past, but I believe in Riot's explanation they also mentioned they want organizations that are going to create rosters that are interesting, exciting, and are going to do something. They want interesting rosters, right? And I think that's something that Evil Geniuses has proved that they will do in League of Legends, right? You look at the different rosters they've produced in League of Legends, especially the past 2 years, and you've seen the whole Danny and JoJo Pion pickups with Inspired as well, right? And that dynamic, you've got bringing in Peter Dunn. You had Jizuke coming into the team last year. As kind of one of the as the mid laner, right? And that was an interesting team to watch. The Evil Geniuses was has been a fun team in League of Legends to watch these past 2 years. Um, and so I think that is kind of one thing that goes in their favor, right? Um, is just their relationship with Riot that they already have. Um, I think that plays a pretty big role, honestly. On top of the fact that Evil Geniuses just have a lot of money, right? They have a lot of money. They're able to use the money that they have to pay for good rosters, right? And it's a big question mark as to whether or not some of the other organizations, would be able to do that, right? Your X sets, your the guards, right? Especially the guard, right? Like they seem to have been a team that was more than the sum of their parts. They really seem like they got the fundamentals. They just worked really, really hard. Those players are not massively expensive when they pick them up, right? Um, and I know what you're thinking, right? Well, these are all things, obviously then you look at like the marketing perspective, right? And Evil Geniuses, while they're not the biggest marketing team, and I definitely give them flack for that, at least with League of Legends, they actually do content for League of Legends. They actually don't slack with the content in League of Legends. So I think that they're probably going to do the same thing with their Valorant roster, I would imagine. And so I don't see the marketing as really being a big deal. I know their Evil Geniuses aren't the best at it, but it's not like they don't do it at all. They actually do a competent amount of marketing work for their League of Legends teams. Um, and then on top of all that, right? Like I think Evil Geniuses was just very invested in Valorant, right? They've been very invested in Valorant since the beginning, right? And they've been trying to be inclusive. Initially they had that roster that had a mix between females and males, with Potter being the in-game leader, and then Potter moved to the coach, and then they tried to, they've done a lot of different things, and now they have the roster they have now, which we'll talk about in a second. But I think um, EG's been very invested in Valorant since the beginning. Um, and I know performance doesn't matter, but I think it's not fair. It isn't fair for people to say that well, EG doesn't deserve it. They're not even that good of a team. When going into LCQ, they were probably one of the top 2 to 3 teams that were favorites to make it through the LCQ. They had taken a series off of Optic, which was something that not many teams had ever done before, right? I don't think that's necessarily fair for people to say that Evil Geniuses was not a good team in Valorant. I think they were a very underrated team in Valorant, if anything. and they just were not able to. NRG just had their number every single time they played in the playoffs for some reason, even though NRG wasn't really that highly rated going into the playoffs, and multiple times. But you look at those things, right, and you can kind of see a multitude of reasons as to why Evil Geniuses would get selected over a team like Optic, who inherited their roster due to the Envy merger that they had. And then while Optic has been producing some content, and they are known as a content organization, and they do have money, they don't have a good, they don't have a very tenured relationship with Riot Games. It's unclear as to how dedicated Optic Gaming really was to Valorant. When I believe even there were rumors that they were going to sell pieces of their team or sell their roster altogether to TSM. Before these franchising teams got announced. So you have to question how dedicated was Optic to Valorant. Where is this something that they really saw as like a long-term investment? And kind of just thinking about all those things is just, I think it's when I mean, just look at the list, guys. It's Cloud9, 100 Thieves, Evil Geniuses, and Team Liquid made it um, in the EMEA franchising league. So, I mean, that's already right there. That's the four top orgs essentially in League of Legends right now. TSM isn't there. I think that's pretty fair for the obvious, reason of all the stuff that happened with Reggie, right? And I think that kind of falls in line with the same logic as the whole why did G2 not make it, right? And I think a lot of people were saying, well, I think if G2 made it, Evil Geniuses would be out. I can almost guarantee you it would have been NRG. I feel like NRG would have been next on the chopping block. The only reason why Sentinels is in is because they had that best roster of all time for a while, and then they switched to content creation. They've been nailing content creation. I think it makes perfect sense for Sentinels to be in there, right? But NRG really doesn't make a whole lot of sense. If I think honestly, if nothing ever happened with G2, I think G2 would be taking the place of NRG right now, to be honest with you. But that's neither here nor there. That does not relate to Evil Geniuses. EG made the franchising. I'm happy for him. I know it was a tough process, so I'm really happy that they ended up making it. And but it does bring up this unsettling question, which is what is going to happen with the Evil Geniuses Valorant roster? Because although the players I'm sure are very happy that they're not immediately searching for a new team because Evil Genius has made franchising, and I would love to say that this roster is good enough and you shouldn't change anything. And I do think this roster is very good. I do think this roster is an extremely good roster. I think they have, with more time, they could even become much better than they are now. I think they could be a really good team. But the question really does become, is it justifiable to do this now? Right now that franchising is the thing, guys, every player is on the market. And when I say every player, I mean every player. I'm talking the best player in the world is on the market. The best player in the world. Okay? The best team in the last year, the most consistent best team in the world is on the market. All five of their players and their coach. Like, anything is possible, right? Anything is possible. Any of these players could get exchanged, right? You are not safe. You are not safe in Valorant right now, okay? Doesn't matter if your team made franchising. Your position as a player is no longer safe in your team because every single player is on the market. Everyone. And I'm stressing that because I think a lot of people are going to sit there and go, well, EG's a family. EG's never going to get rid of any players. Why would they? Their roster is actually pretty good. Like, they've got a lot of young players who can, take time to develop. Guys, it's not about developing talent when you're in the franchised league. When you're in the franchise league, I mean, let me take a step back. Yes, developing talent does matter. I'm not saying it doesn't. And you should be developing talent. But if you have players who have been on your roster who are not performing for a considerable period of time, and every single player, like, guys, what other scenario have you ever seen where every single player, including the best players in the world, are on the market? It never happens. This is an opportunity that will never happen again. And if you're Evil Geniuses and you're not calling Optic about Yay, I don't know what you're doing. I do not know what you're doing because this is ridiculous. I mean, this is insane. I've never seen a scenario where where you have so much talent within a region, within and nobody is safe. Any player is exchangeable for any other player, right? I mean, you got to consider because you guys like you got to sit there and you got to think like, well, Boostio's safe. He's the in-game leader, and he's no. Even Boostio isn't safe. You want to know why Boostio isn't safe? Because even though he's an in-game leader and he's a star player and everything, and he's an incredible person, I really love Boostio. I really do. I love all these players on this team. I really do. But when you have the best player in the world on the market, and like the best in-game leader. And I'm not even just talking about the Optic Gaming players specifically. I mean, for God's sakes, Asuna technically is on the market. I know 100 Thieves is probably going to try to keep him with everything all the power in the world, but you can bet for the right price. There's always an opportunity. Cryo Cells, he's on the market. Tens, he's on the market. I'm sure Tens would be willing to move teams if you gave him a competitive roster. Because if Sentinels doesn't give him a competitive roster, he's going to want to move. And those are just star players. I mean, as much as I hate Marved, and I think he's a scumbag for what he did in Counter Strike, he's one of the best role players in the world. You can pick up Marved, right? You can pick up Baby Bay right now. Guys, the amount of players on the market is unreal. It is so insane. If you're Evo Geniuses and you aren't looking at changing your roster because I like the players and they're very we have a lot of potential and all this, you are failing yourselves. You are failing yourselves. You're not doing your due diligence and you're not doing your job. At the end of the day, yes, culture is massively important. And I think the culture in Evil Geniuses is really, really strong. I really think Nicole seriously cares for every single person in the organization. I think you genuinely, when you're inside the org, you really do feel like you're in a family environment. I truly believe that when they say family environment, I truly believe that they do mean it. I don't think they're lying. But I think the obvious problem with constantly saying that you're a family is that eventually when a player leaves because they aren't performing well enough, right? Or somebody leaves and somebody leaves the organization, it's you draw the parallel to family and you go, but if you're family, why you don't cut your family, right? And so that's kind of it's a valid point of criticism when it comes to the whole family discussion. And I know Evil Geniuses, the management, the players, everyone's memeing it right now. They're all kind of joking around with the whole family thing, um, because people are really criticizing it. But I think it's just I don't think it would be reasonable, right, for Evil Geniuses to not be looking at these other players in the scene. I think that's a massively missed opportunity if they don't do it, right? So I know that's kind of a scary note to end on with the whole Valorant roster and everything. But I just think, guys, it's extremely important to keep that in mind. The roster moves, I think, are able to be announced either. I think I mean, as of the time of recording this tomorrow, so when you're watching this, maybe could be Monday. I think is when roster moves are able to be announced and or done in general. And so I just think like, man, if you're Evil Geniuses, you've got to be looking at making roster changes. I know that hurts to say. I really like this team. I really like all the players on this team. And especially when you consider like how involved the families of some of these players are in Evil Geniuses, like Boostio's parents and Calm's parents, and those are the ones that stick out in my mind the most. They've been very vocal on Twitter and whatnot, and I think like and I seriously care for those players, right? And I obviously I wish the best for them and their families, but when you have an opportunity like this as an organization, I think you have to take it. You have to at least try your best to get the best possible roster you can make. Especially when you consider that literally the best players in the world are on the market. I think that's just it would be foolish not to, right? So, I'm sorry, but that needed to be said. It needed to be said because I think, naively coming into this and expecting you to keep the same roster would just be uh, foolish. It would be foolish because all these teams are going to be looking for better players. You don't think Cloud9 is going to be trying to shop for Ye? Seriously? You can bet that they're going to be shopping for Ye, even though they have Leaf. You can bet they're shopping for Ye right now. Everyone is shopping for the best players. Evil Geniuses should be no different. Okay? All right. So, sorry, that was a little somewhat dark, right? In the sense of having to move on from players that I think everyone has really cared about, appreciated, love to watch, love to see their interactions and everything. But I think, and I'm not saying that they're going to with every player, but I am saying with there's you've got to look at players, right? You've just got to, you can't miss an opportunity like this. It's just too big. But we're going to be switching topics. We're going to Counter-Strike, ladies and gents. We are going to Counter-Strike. And we are going to be talking very, 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 very briefly on the female CSGO team because it's just going to be a pretty brief segment because they have been playing some games, and I just wanted to point out that they have been for ESL Impact. They played that game against CLG Red. They narrowly lost in a 0-2 game. It was a pretty close match. This was, I think, exactly a week ago that they played this match. And it was a close series. They ended up losing 2-0 though, and they've played a couple games this week. I tried to catch some of them. I know there was one game that had a forfeit, and then the one series I did end up watching, they ended up destroying this like some team like 16-3 or something. That might have been only one map. I can't even remember. I just know that they absolutely dominated one of the games they played against. I think it was against Flash. Hot Flash. Piggy Kiki in particular was just popping off. I don't know, the whole team was popping off. They were just killing everybody. People were just disrespecting everything. They were just pushing into their enemy team spawn in like the first 15 seconds of the rounds. Like it was crazy. It was mental. But I just wanted to give them a brief shout out just because they have been playing games. I don't want to just neglect it. And I'm actually kind of looking forward to seeing how well, especially now that like all these ESL partner teams have been picking up rosters like Astralis and NIP. Like, I'm assuming there's going to be a LAN event where these teams are all going to play against each other, and I'm going to be really interested to see how that turns out because I actually think this EG roster is a little bit better than I actually thought it was going to be. I don't really have any expectations for it, honestly. But hey, man, like taking CLG to a close series, and it seemingly looks like they're cleaning house, with the rest of Impact. I think those are good signs, obviously. And so who knows? I don't. I have to keep up and figure out when some of these events are. It's sometimes hard to find them. They're not like front page of HLTV, obviously. But yeah. So I just wanted to give them a brief shout out. Just let everybody know I'm keeping track. I'm not just not watching stuff. Um, but yeah, overall good signs and hopefully whenever I'm going to keep track of when there's a bigger event for them, like a playoff stage event or maybe like like I said, like an ESL Impact where you have all the best teams all at the tournament. I think this team could do some damage. So we'll see how it goes. I'm looking forward to seeing them play against some tough opposition because obviously, like I said, the game I watched, they beat a team like 16-3. It was like an absolute joke. But yeah, moving on, we're going to be talking about first team that we're going to be talking about is EG White because now they're called EG White. They were called EGPA, but now they are EG White. And there's not a massive amount to talk about here, but they did compete in the Blast Premier Qualifier, which is called the ACE North American Masters Fall 2022. And basically, there were 8 teams that were in, 8 teams in the qualifier. The number 1 seed, or the not the number 1 seed, but if you win this event, this qualifier, you get to go to the Blast Premier Fall Showdown and the Flow Fire League 2022 Global Finals, which I'm assuming is like the Tier 2 Blast event. I can only presume. I could be wrong. EG White participated in this event. They ended up in their group. They were in Group B, which had Strife, ATK, and Brazen, which is a pretty strong group, not gonna lie. They ended up being second place in their group, going 2-1. I believe they lost to Strife in a overtime match. And so then they went to the playoffs. They played against Team 1, and they got defeated 2-0. They got beat 2-0, 16-8 Mirage, 16-12 on Nuke, and Mobs looked like he performed a pretty had a pretty strong performance overall for Team One. But essentially, I guess what are my thoughts on this? What are my thoughts of them getting third to fourth? I think it's underperformance, frankly. I think you expect EG White to beat Team One and to be the best team at this event. When I look at this event in specifically, I just think EG White probably the best team at this event. Probably should have at the very least been in the grand finals. So not that I'm not trying to say that Team One is a bad team or that Team One should never be able to beat EG White, but I think if you're given a best of three, I think you have to favor EG White, and so them not winning that I think is a little disappointing. It's not the end of the world, and frankly, as I'm going to get into, it's probably better that they didn't end up winning this from a logistical standpoint, in the sense that, guys, like I mentioned, if you take first place in this event, you go to the Blast Premier Fall Showdown. Well, guess what other team is in the Blast Premier Fall Showdown? Evil Geniuses, the main roster. They're in the showdown because they didn't do that well in the fall groups. That would have been a nightmare. That would have been a conflict of interest. I can only assume what would have happened is that EG White would have had to say, yes, we took first place. Maybe that means they go to the Flow Fire League 2022 Global Finals, and that whichever team they played in the final ends up going to the showdown, right? That's the only thing I can think of, because had Blast, at the end of the day, that would come up to Blast, like Blast would have to make that decision. And I would hope that they would make the decision that I just mentioned, because if they didn't and they allowed them to play, that is a massive problem. You would have gotten the conflict of interest thing all over again, and it would have been taken much more seriously, because hey, this ain't just a Fragadelphia, even though I think that was a lame thing to say, for the Fragadelphia discussion, because Fragadelphia had European teams and had some pretty, some good squads, right? But whatever. But now you're talking about a Blast Fall Showdown, like that is one of the bigger events of the year for a team like this, right? So I think that would have been a massive conflict of interest problem again. And so it's good to avoid that, but the cost of it is that they did not end up, they just didn't perform well enough to beat Team One and move on to the grand finals. Currently, right now, Nouns and Team One are playing in the final, and although it was looking good for Nouns in the first map, it has not looked good since. So that's kind of unfortunate. I was kind of hoping Nouns would kind of make it through and beat Team One, but that's besides the point. The point is a little bit disappointing result for EG White. But overall avoided another conflict of interest. So that is like this for me, because I don't want to have to talk about that again. So yeah, moving on. Now we're going to be talking about EG Black. And I actually have some interesting things to say about EG Black. Last episode, I was frustrated with EG Black because I didn't know where the star potential was on the roster. It just felt like Stanislaw and Rush were like kind of being like top performers, and when that's what's happening on your academy roster, that's serious concern, because you're looking for the next talent to move into the main roster, right? So you don't want your support player and your in-game leader, who are already massively experienced and are supposed to be the players developing the younger talent. You don't want those guys being your top players, because that means that your younger players aren't developing, right? But something on this team has me very excited. And it's not something that I expected, but it's Wiz. Guys, Wiz has been incredible recently. I don't know that anybody is talking about Wiz, but like, you guys got to look at his recent results and his recent performances in ECL. He has been by far the best player for this team. And it's encouraging too, because he's an opper. And I think for the longest time now, people have been saying that they want to see Pone alone move into the op role. If, because, and I'll get to it when I talk about the Blueprint project, but there's some reasons why people are saying you have to move players from the academy rosters into the main roster instead of just bringing in players from outside of your Blueprint project, right? I'll get into that a little bit later. But a lot of people have been putting up Pone alone as the next option, and I just think when you're that might be a good band-aid fix, because Circa's been underperforming, for so long. But I think, like, Pone alone is, what, 30 plus years old at this point. He's hitting his peak, right? He's not going to get immensely better joining the main roster, right? I just don't see. It might be a nice band-aid fix because Cirque is underperforming, but if you want this team to really take the next step, right? Cirque, even though he's performing worse than Pone alone, you could argue, um, Cirque also just has a higher ceiling, right? A potential ceiling. And so I think that's a big reason why Pone hasn't been moved up. And again, I will talk about the Blueprint project in a second and why I think that's a big deal and whatnot. But when you think like before, it was just the only contender for that slot really was Pone alone, and now I look at Wiz and I think, well, I don't know. Now, what I don't know is this the system? Is this EG Black's system setting Wiz up always in the right scenario? Or is Wiz also just really individually skilled so far, like recently, and he's just been posting really good numbers? It's tough to say. But because some of these games have been hard to watch. But let me go through some of these recent results. I'm going to start off with EG Black's lost to Team 1 in Fragadelphia. This is the match that eliminated them from Fragadelphia in the playoffs, okay? I'm going to go from every single game from this game forward till today. Although I think they are playing right. They're playing. Actually, they started a game I think like 28 minutes ago. But regardless, we're going to talk about every game. Up until this point, right? So against Team 1 in Fragadelphia, they ended up losing the series 2-1. They won the first map 16-14, lost the next map 16-5, lost the next map 16-11. Wiz was the only positive player on Evil Geniuses. He went 61 and 53, and he had a 1.15 rating, which was the highest on his team, and he was tied for the second most kills on the server with he was tied with Malbs, although he had a better killed to death ratio than Malbs, and he had a slightly worse ADR though. But regardless, he was 61 and 53. He was the only positive player on Evil Geniuses, right? So that was their best of 3 against Team 1 at Frag. Then the next best of 1 that they played, rather, was against Victorum in the ESL Challenger Rotterdam 2022 North America Qualifier, I think. Now, in this match, they ended up winning this match 16-10. I was on Mirage, and while you may look at it and say, well, Wiz was the third best, highest rated player, how good is that? Well, he went 20 and 12. He had a 1.32 rating. I don't, that's a very good result. Obviously, that's not blowing everything out of the water, but 20 and 12 is that's a good result. That's not a knock on him. Then they played Iron Blood, which for those who are unaware, Iron Blood is the roster with Dare, Intra, Droid, Snav, and Shane, which is a pretty talented roster. They ended up losing this best of 1, 16-12. And although they lost 16-12, Wiz was tied for Evil Geniuses on the most kills, going 20 and 17, and he had a 1.05 rating. He was the fourth highest. He was rated fourth highest in terms of rating on his team, so he was second to last. But he went 20 and 17, which is I think still pretty good. And this is where things start getting a little bit insane. As of recent, guys, they lost to MIBR in a best of 3 2-0, 16-14, 16-13. Wiz was the highest rated player on Evil Geniuses. He was positive 16. He had a 1.3 rating. He was 52 and 36 in a series they lost 2-0. 52 and 36, guys. The second best player on Evil Geniuses was Walco, who was 37 and 40. Monster numbers. And this is against MIBR, which is, look, they're not a tier 1 team, but they're still they're probably on the upper echelon of tier 2 teams, right? EG Black, then they played Unjustified. Unjustified's not that good of a roster. They kind of blew this team out of the water in a 2-0 series. But what's important is Wiz was far and away the best player in the server. He was 53 and 16. He had a 2.15 rating against Unjustified. The next best player on Evil Geniuses was Stanislaw, 33 and 20. He just dominated this series, I should say. Then the next series. Next match. Yeah, series. They lost 2-0 to Team 1 again, but this was in ECL. These last couple have been in ECL. Wiz was the best player on the team. He was 44 and 35 with a 1.29 rating. losing 2-0, by the way. Walco is the next best, 41 and 33. But he had a considerably less rating. He had a 1.08 rating. I'm not trying to get too hang up on the stats, but you can start to see the theme here. Wiz has really been performing even in games that they're losing, which I think is important because that shows consistency. And so that's all the games that they've played up until now. Obviously, they're playing one right now, but I don't really know what's happening with that game. But Wiz has really been performing, and I think like man, if he really keeps this up throughout ECL, and maybe they do something at playoffs, and Wiz really really starts performing like seriously well, he keeps this up essentially. Um, you can make a pretty good case that Wiz should get moved up to the main roster, if if Cirque doesn't start performing right. Yeah, I just kind of wanted to bring that up. I feel like nobody's talking about Wiz, and I think that's just not fair considering how well he's been playing recently. So I just wanted to give him a shout out because I really do. I have been impressed, and I hope he continues the form because if there's one thing that Evil Genius is seriously lacking right now, it's strong offers. NA in general is lacking strong offers, and Wiz was never, you know, he's not exactly like hyped up to be this incredible opera or anything, but he has been performing. You cannot deny the numbers. He has been performing recently, and so I just think let the time tell, and if he's able to continue this, like I see no reason as to why Wiz can't be brought up into the main roster. If Cirque doesn't start performing the way that we want him to. Sorry about that. That is my Steam notifications. Just gonna. Uh, okay. Okay. So that's kind of all I wanted to talk about with the EG Black roster, guys. We are getting into one of the main topics, and I know tough to be getting into one of the main topics here at 46 minutes, but that's just how this episode has been. How this episode is going to go, guys. We are going to be talking about. Can't even speak now. We are going to be talking about the blueprint. I'm sorry, I can't spell. The blueprint project. I really can't speak. I'm so sorry. Now, why am I talking about? And it doesn't even fit. That is so sad, isn't it? We're just going to get rid of this part. There we go. That should fit. Now, why are we talking about the Blueprint Project? Well, we are talking about the Blueprint Project because it's extremely important. It's extremely important to figure out what is the direction that this project is heading in. Because right now, it's kind of an unknown. The ESL Pro League desk was talking about how they weren't really sure what was going on with the team in terms of the coaching staff, which I want to touch on first. But first, I just want to mention that overall, it's just something that not evil geniuses, other than saying, "Hey guys, we're doing this blueprint project. Pretty cool, isn't it?" Yeah, there's been like no information. There has been no clarity in terms of how everything is structured. What are the goals for each specific team? These are things that I think are fair for the fans and for anyone in general to know, right? If people, it's just you can't just say we're doing, we're doing this is our plan. Um, it's called this, and then just have like no description about what the plan is about, other than it's to bring back NACS. It's like, okay, well, like that's cool and all, but what are you doing to bring up NACS, right? Like what are the goals for these teams? How is this going to improve NACS, right? Like you're just basically leaving everything to speculation at this point. And I don't think that's entirely fair. I think there should definitely be some clear-cut guidelines because fans will start to question if you haven't told us the specifications for what these rosters are for, what are the goals for each roster, how is everything being structured, how are the coaches being involved with the players, right? Like if you're not saying these things, then you as a fan you start to question, well, does the org even know what they're doing, or are they just doing this because it's a unique thing to do and it's going to generate publicity, right? Like those are questions that you're going to ask, right? And I think the media have been asking it for a while now, and I think it's fair game. Quite frankly. So I know EG's been memeing it. I know they've been joking around with the whole like, oh, rocket scientists and all this jazz. And I think it's a good thing that they are messing around with it. But I just don't think it's fair to just for them to mess around with it, but then never actually come out and say what's actually happening with the plan, because then you just start to look incompetent, right? And that you're just messing around, that you don't really care. And so I think it's important to have this kind of clarity. And so because Evil Geniuses is not giving us the clarity themselves, I am going to speculate and because I've thought about this quite deeply as to what the project is now and what I think the expectations are for this project will be moving forward, right? Specifically for each team and the coaching staff and whatnot. So first, let's start with the coaching staff because, like I said, ESL Pro League was talking about it on the desk, and I think that's a good place to start because like we had talked about last week, they brought in Malik, and like I also said last week, I think they brought in Malik a little bit too late in the sense of, he's going to be helping with the strategical depth of the team, and I think the main roster is quite clearly going to be the main priority considering that they're qualifying for the major in a week. I think Malik should probably be spending all of his time on that roster and not really spending any time with any of the other rosters, at least for right now, right? Um, and but I think they brought him in a little bit late because I think Nealon has just, and I'll talk about this a little bit more once we start specifically talking about the main roster, but I think it's quite clear that Nealon has been the one in control in terms of the strategy, and not that that's a bad thing, but I think Malik can bring a lot of perspective to the strategic calling that's going on in the game, and I think that he can bring a lot of value there, and so that's something, and really guide Nealon in the right direction, and see where the flaws are and whatnot. And so I think that's something that he's really going to help with. I see Malik overall in this project being the strategical kind of advisor. He's going to be the coach that you go to when you want to try to learn a little bit more about, what strategies are you running, what type of play style do you want to have, that type of stuff, more the strategical side of coaching. I think that's what he's going to help on. Not that he can't help on the other side with the emotional thing and talk to players and get to know them better and kind of develop a relationship with them and help them from a mental aspect. I think he can definitely do both, right? He can do both extremely well. But I think considering that you have Vorborg, who's such a, who has a very good mind as a GM and also seems to be a really good emotional leader for the team, I think that you're going to have a Malik focus a little bit more on the strategical side, right? So that's what comes to mind, at least to me, when I see these coaches. But again, some of that is just coming down to my own speculation. It hasn't really been announced as to, or not announced, but it hasn't really been like clearly disclosed as to what the coaching staff, like how does it all work, right? Um, I think it's been mentioned that Valens is kind of like their boss, which I guess makes sense, although I never really thought about it that way. Um, but yeah, it's kind of unclear as to how all the teams are working together. Have these teams even scrimmed each other? I don't think they have very much, if at all, because they've all been like, E.g. White was in Australia, and then E.g. Black has been in NA the whole time, and then the main roster has been in Europe multiple times. And then when they were in NA, they were doing the qualifier for the major, and then they had like a little bit of a break. So like, I just don't see how I don't think these teams have really scrimmed each other very much, if at all. But I think that's something to expect in the future, or at least I would hope so, because that's how you can kind of make everyone better and also just kind of that's easy scrim practice, right? I mean that takes even less time to set up because you're dealing with rosters that are within your own organization, right? Um, and so, these are all things to think about. And so I think from the coaching perspective, I'd like to see it get disclosed in terms of who is doing what, what is going on here, because otherwise you start to question if, well, do the coaches even know what they're supposed to be doing, or are they kind of just doing this on the fly? And not that Vorborg and Malik aren't smart enough to be able to do that. It's just it's important. I like when I think of League of Legends and how the EG League of Legends team is structured. You can clearly tell like Peter Dunn is like the mastermind, right? He's the guy at the top of the food chain who like all the assistant coaches and coach of the main roster, right? They look up to Peter Dunn. Peter Dunn has control over the main roster, and he also looks over kind of like talent scouting for the academy rosters, right? He has his hands in everything. And so, is that what Valens' job is? Is he similar to like the Peter Dunn of the CS:GO division? That's something we don't know. But if they are going to state that Valens is kind of like the head honcho for the management and like the coaching staff, then I would expect Valens to be the guy who's kind of looking at talent, trying to figure out who's the next player that we should try to bring in, that type of thing. And that's kind of how I see the coaching staff at the moment. I see Valens as being the head honcho guy, the Peter Dunn, so to speak. And then you kind of have Malik being the more strategic side, although again he can help with the mental side, but I think he's going to be mainly focusing on the strategic aspect of the game. And you're going to have Vorborg kind of being the, obviously using his GM expertise somewhat to figure out who he wants to move into the main roster, but also helping with the mental aspect of the game, right? Trying to make sure that everyone's mental is in the right place. So that's kind of how I see things um, with the coaching staff. Now, as for the plans for EG White and EG Black in the future, we have some serious question marks about that. I talked about this last week briefly about how I wanted EG White to be in the We Play Academy League, but due to age restriction rules, they obviously would not be able to do that. And it makes me seriously question what is EGPA's role within um, within the Blueprint project as it currently stands. Because if they're not competing in ECL, which is the NA league that they would be competing in, and they can't play in We Play, which means that's the other international, right, like league that you could join as a young team, and kind of try to get better and work your way. And it's been proven that these teams that are playing in these We Play Academy leagues, if you really perform in the We Play Academy league, you actually can compete. If you're a good enough player, and it shows in the We Play Academy League, you can actually get like some seriously, like, look at the Mouse Sports players and Monzi, for example, and even Headtrick, right? Like, and the big academy players have been performing and been moved up and down, and some have shown like some pretty good results, right? Like, if you're a good enough player in the We Play Academy League, and your team performs, like, you have serious potential to move up to Tier One, right? And it's international experience, which is invaluable, right? That's what you want as a young player. Is you want to be able to play against international opposition, play against different styles and whatnot, and against better players. And so if EG has two academy rosters and neither team is playing in the We Play Academy League, that just doesn't make sense to me. And here's why I don't think it's as simple as saying, okay, well, if that's the case, then EG Black should be going to the We Play Academy League. Number one, I don't even think that's possible because of Stanislaw and Rush. But for sake of example, let's say you just say, oh, well, EG Black then goes to the We Play Academy League, and then EG White goes to ECL. Well, that doesn't make any sense at all because EG White is a better team than EG Black. So you're going to send the worst team to the harder international league, and you're going to send the better team to a league within NA they're pretty much just going to rout everybody. Or I mean, that's an over exaggeration, but they're going to be like a favorite for the whole thing. Like, I just don't know that that's necessarily the right approach, right? So when I kind of look at this, I don't think the EGCD team is, or rather the EG Black team. I think they're headed in an interesting and good direction in the sense of, um, or they've made some good steps in terms of um, you know, signing Stanislaw and Rush. I think I think keeping Rush and moving him to this roster and then bringing in Stanislaw, I think that's, with the idea in mind that these are two veterans who have like serious tier 1 experience, who can kind of guide young players along the right path and get and develop them. And I think when you look at like how teams are formatted or structured, I should say, what you want, like, you don't want the star player on the academy team to be the old guy, the veteran, right? That's not what you want. What you want is you want the support player and the in-game leader to be the veterans, right? The guys that are setting people up to succeed. You want those guys to be the veterans, and you want the star players and the opper to be your two-star riflers and your opper. You want those three pieces to be the young players with talent, right? That's what you want, because you want those players to learn and develop, right? And then eventually be able to move them on, right? And so how I see the whole structure is what I think should be the case in an ideal world is that EG Black should be the team competing in ECL. They should have a young roster with with young star riflers and a young star opper. And you should have Stanislaw and Rush developing those three players to try to build them up and make them better, right? The next thing is that EG White should be also a young roster, but they should be a roster that's good enough to where they should be able to compete in the We Play Academy League. So when I think of like a young roster like this, I think of like a Nouns type of team. I think of Nouns. Nouns is the first name that comes to my mind. Strife is another name that comes to my mind, right? I'm trying to find this tournament that we were talking about earlier, right? This Blast Premier Qualifier, because it's got a couple teams in there that I think are good candidates, right? I think Strife and Nouns are just the two obvious ones. Even the Iron Blood roster would be an interesting one, although I think they need a little bit of mental, guidance in terms of their decision making and whatnot. So maybe it's better for them to get under, take some of those players and bring them on as like. I'll get to that in a second. Basically, I think E.G. White should be a team like Strife or a team like Nouns, a team with young players that can compete in the We Play Academy League and get better internationally, right? I'm not saying that either team should be better than the other necessarily. I'm just thinking in my head it makes the most sense for both of your teams to be competing in a league. I think it would make more sense for E.G. White to be the better of the two Academy League teams in the sense that they should be better in the sense that they're playing international competition and they should be a better team, which is why I'm picking a team like Nouns or Strife, because those are teams that are at the upper echelon of Tier 2 and NA, and it would make more sense for those teams to be competing in the We Play Academy League, um, rather than like picking, let's see here, like a Limitless. Limitless is just the first that comes to mind. I know they're in advanced, but that's the first thing that comes. Limitless is obviously would not be prepared to go to a We Play Academy League as of right now. I would hope that they would be in the future because I really like their roster and I watch them all the time. But that's besides the point. So that's kind of how I see this whole blueprint project being structured. I think that you should have EG Black in ECL, EG White in the We Play Academy League, and that's how you're going to really develop those players, right? But here's the other thing. I think that these I don't mean to how do I say this without sounding like a jerk? Players the Academy League rosters should be the most, I don't want to say the most stressful, but they should be cutthroat in the sense that you get one season with the roster. You get one ECL season, you get one We Play Academy League season. If you are performing, you stay. If you are not performing, you go. Unless you're Stanislaw or Rush, right? Unless you're Stanislaw or Rush, because Stanislaw and Rush, obviously Stanislaw's the in-game leader, Rush is, whatever, and there's nobody really to fill in that slot, right? But I think that's what makes the most sense, is for these to be cutthroat rosters, because if you're looking for the best talent, right? If you're looking for the best talent, and I'm not saying like, look, let's say E.G. White is doing really well in the We Play Academy League, and they're improving and they're looking really really good, and there's a lot of potential here. But man, one player on their team just like he's providing a lot of impact, but he's just not all that good. I'm not saying to get rid of that player. That's not what I'm saying. What I am saying is, if you play on the roster, you're expected to hit a certain level, and you do not reach it within that league, within that season of the league, you should be considered for the chopping block, because at the end of the day, this is in the mindset of improving the scene, and we want to find the next best players in the NA region, right? So it should be this cutthroat type of thing. And the reason why I bring this up is because when I look at EG Black, something that I think they haven't done well is that although Wiz has been performing better, which may be to the credit of Stanislaw and Rush, I don't really understand. I know this sounds bad. I don't understand why Walco is on this roster. I really don't. It doesn't make any sense. He was the in-game leader for EGCD. You've completely ripped that roster apart. I just don't. There is no rifle firepower. There's no young rifle firepower to develop on this squad. Walco and Chop, they have not shown to me that they are, as of yet, right? Obviously, give them the rest of the ECL season to prove me wrong. But I think this is the kind of thing where maybe you bring back Classia at the end of the season if things haven't improved, or you potentially bring in some of the riflers, or some of the players from the Iron Blood roster, right? Because they have shown some bragging potential, right? bring in some of those players. I think the EG Black team should be bringing in players like star riflers and oppers, or people, young players with potential that are maybe a little bit lower on the list, right? Your Iron Bloods, your Brazens, right? Like those rosters, your X13s maybe. Those are the kind of teams that maybe you kind of take from, or try to take from, right? And that's kind of how I see it. And if you're EG Black, you might be saying, well, yeah, but what if that team does better than you in playoffs? Like, why would that player want to sign with you instead of staying with the roster? Because you're evil geniuses, and the expectation is that you could potentially join the main roster, obviously. And so that's kind of how I see that roster working. With Stanislaw and Rush being the supportive elements, and you bring in young players, and I don't really see what Walco and Chop are really doing now that they seem to be like the foundation for EGCD, but now that you've pretty much blown up EGCD, I don't really understand why they're here. And that sounds really harsh, but that's just what I'm seeing. Okay. And we'll see if they prove me wrong by the end of ECL, and they end up stepping up and looking real good. Listen, I'll eat my words. Like, I'll take that. That I won't be upset about that at all. But it's just something to consider, and I think it should be taken into consideration moving. In terms of looking ahead, right? Now, as for the EG White team, I think this should be a roster that I mean, you want to be honest. I think the obvious pickup is Nouns, and why do I say Nouns? Because not only are these players extremely talented, and they did just lose to Team One. They're not going to be going to the fall showdown, but this team has serious potential. These players are very good. They do. I think they have had some behavioral issues in the past, but at this point, one NA team hasn't. I think if you're EG, you take that risk in the sense of you have the veterans and the coaching staff and management, and you're playing for a big org, and you should be able to help them move past those issues. If you really do mean to develop talent, right, you should be able to do that at a minimum. So I think you shouldn't be afraid of that at all. These players are extremely talented. They were Gaming Gladiators. They are going to be playing you in the major qualifier. I think it just makes sense. I think if Gaming Gladiators, again, like I said this last week, if Gaming Gladiators hadn't signed didn't have this roster at the time that EG was making 2 academy teams, I think this roster would have gotten picked up, honestly, by EG. And another reason that nobody has thought about as to why this would be a good pickup is because Semphis is one of the coaches, I believe he's a coach, on this team. I mean, that is so obvious to me. Like, if you're looking for people who have had experience in the North American scene at the tier 1 level, I know it's been a long time for Semphis. He hasn't been in tier 1 for a long time, but he's a good role model. He's a good role model. He's a good person, right? And so I think that just obviously makes sense. That just obviously makes sense. So if I'm EG and I get to the end of the major and ECL's finished and obviously whatnot, and EG White's not really doing anything because they have no league to compete in. There's nothing else to qualify for because they're essentially just going into qualifiers at this point, just going to any tournament they can essentially just to have something to do. If you get to the end of this whole season, I think you got to consider, like, dude, maybe we just, excuse me, maybe, and it sounds sad, but maybe we get rid of this roster entirely in the favor of bringing in a Nouns team, right, with Semphis. And you could even keep the coach if you want to keep, is it Moonster or is it, oh, I feel terrible because I've lost the name. But you can keep the coach of EG White. That's fine. That's fine. Okay, that's fine. I just, and I'm not saying they should do that. I hate to say these things because it sounds like because EG constantly stresses their family, and obviously you never, these are players' lives that you're talking about, and you don't want to like sound like a jerk by saying, oh, you should just cut the whole roster even though they won Fragadelphia. Like, you know what I mean? Like, I know that sounds ridiculous and crazy, but when I think about the long-term aspirations for the project, if EG White is just going to be competing in just random qualifiers, like, and no, you're going to have, so you're telling me you're going to have 2 academy rosters. One of them is going to be an ECL, and you're not going to have a single roster that we play Academy League. That makes no sense. That makes absolutely no sense. That makes less sense than keeping EGPA. EG White as it currently stands. In my opinion. If you want to develop the next upcoming talent in NA. That does not make sense to me. So, I know this is harsh, I know this is critical. I know I'm probably not going to be everyone's biggest fan for saying this, obviously. But I just think, like, this just is where this is just what makes sense in my mind for what should be the plan for this project. Because at the end of the day, you can't keep everyone just because you like them. They have to perform. Or they have to be able to participate in the events that are required for the project to be successful. And at the end of the day, E.G. White is kind of just going to random events at this point. Anything they can go to, they're trying to go to in the hopes of getting some type of competition. And I just don't think it's not fair to them because they're not going to get to, any higher standard, right? I mean, I think they're a good enough team where, like, look, if they weren't under EG's banner, there's a chance they're going back to the major again, right? To the qualifier again this year, right? Like, I just think it's actually a disservice to them at this point. They're too good to not be signed by a decent a decent organization, but their age range doesn't meet the requirements of the We Play Academy League, and because EG already has an ECL roster, there's no room for them. There's no room. So I just don't. It's tough, but I just don't see where they fit in. I don't see where they fit in, and that sounds harsh. They just won Fragadelphia. I know, I get it, but I just don't see where else they fit in here. Um, they may have to get rid of them in exchange for Nouns, because Nouns, I think, as far as I am aware, would be able to compete. If they're not able to compete, then obviously I would say find a team that is young enough and is good enough to where you think they could get some good experiences from going to the We Play Academy League, right? Um, so, all right, that's kind of it. Also, I want to say this. EG better not, now that this whole Valorant franchising thing has happened, and that franchises that didn't make franchising, might go back to Counter-Strike, they better not start selling these rosters. Like, here's the thing. You know what? You know what I was just saying about EG White in terms of it's going to be sad to get rid of them if they end up doing what I'm speculating the plan might be. Try to sell EG White to one of these organizations that just got out of Valorant is looking to get back in Counter-Strike. I'm sure they're going to be at least one. EG White makes sense for that. EG White makes perfect sense for that. And I know people are going to give you criticism and say, well, you were just doing this to sell your team off and make money. It's like, no, but when you look at what the project is intended for, I think this would just make sense. And I think, but what I want to say about this is do not just sell both rosters and then just like never have an academy team again. If you did this for a cheap buck, Evil Geniuses, I'm going to lose so much respect for you. You better not be selling both of these rosters to two other, organizations looking to get back into Counter-Strike and then not signing two more sets of players. You better be freaking committed to this, okay? Because you did this and you marketed it, you better stick to it. I don't care if you have 10 completely different players. If you've sold, if you sell those 10 players and then you buy 10 more players, that's fine. But if you sell 10 players and you don't pick up any more rosters, and you just say, well, the academy teams, that just, we tried to do it, but it didn't really work out. Bad idea, whatever. You suck for that. Don't do that. You're not sticking to your word. Commit to your word. I did mention here is EG a family, just like in the sense of like, this is kind of a topic I've been mentioning briefly around, which is just like, they keep saying they're a family, but obviously when you have academy rosters like this, and we want to find the next talent and develop them and really make them better so that you can potentially put them on your main roster because your main roster isn't looking so hot right now. Whew. It's inevitable as much as the players may feel like Evil Genius is his family and you treat them like family, which I think is good. I'm not saying that's a bad thing. It's good to have that type of culture, but at the end of the day, some of these players are not going to be here in a little bit. That's just how it's going to be, right? And it's nothing personal, right? And I hope that players who leave Evil Geniuses, especially if they're from Counter-Strike, are going to another organization that can pay them, number one. I hope so, at least. But even if they don't, they shouldn't be getting. I hope they don't get flack. This is something that is expected, right? If you're on one of these rosters, you should be expected if you don't perform to get removed. And I think that's inevitable, frankly. I think I hope that players that do end up leaving Evil Geniuses end up saying like, you know what, I you know I I love I love the organization. It's a shame I wasn't good enough to compete or whatever or something along those lines. But I get worried with the whole family talk just because it obviously implies like, well, the next step is obviously okay. Well, when things aren't going well and you remove players, were you really family? They were so much like your family, you decided to kick them out and kick them out of the family. It's like, okay, so that's just a concern, like I said, that I've been bringing up recently. Oh, I also did want to mention real quick with EG Black, bring back Classia for Walco. I know I'm dogging on Walco, man. I feel really bad about it, but I don't understand also why they got rid of Classia. That makes no sense, but whatever. I know he had behavioral issues, but like, dude, you're evil geniuses. You have management staff up. You have more resources than anyone. If you can't help that, like, you're not doing your job. You know. All right, that is enough about the Blueprint project. Hopefully, my thoughts they're a little scattered toward the end, I think, but hopefully you can kind of understand my vision for both teams and how I think one should be going to ECL, one should be going to WePlay. You have the main roster competing in the main events, and then that's kind of how you can cipher through kind of who's good, who's showing potential, what should we do here, like you can even move certain players depending on again their age between the ECL roster and the WePlay roster, right? Like I think that's something you could do, right? Um, so that's how I envision everything, but again, could be totally wrong. But I think it's important to kind of bring that information to the forefront of people's minds because it's something that it shouldn't just be a meme. It is a serious topic and it should be discussed. Moving on to the CSGO main roster. We have finally made it, guys. We have finally made it to the main roster. It has only taken us a total of 1 hour and 16 minutes, but we have made it. So, ESL Pro League Group D. For those of you who are, for some reason, living under a rock, Group D consisted of Cloud9, Furia, Team Liquid, Evil Geniuses, Eternal Fire, and Movie Star Riders. EG was projected in this group to be the worst team in the group and to not win a single series. And for anyone who says otherwise, they are lying to you. I saw all of it. They were projected to be the worst team in Group D because they have been the worst team in every ESL group for the past like 2 years or something like that. And in fact have not won a friggin' map or a series or anything. It's been sad. They might have won a map, but they definitely didn't win a series. They ended up going 2-3 in Group D, and when it's funny when you look at this group, just as the table, just with wins and losses, you're it's strange because it's just like they barely missed out on playoffs, which I think is the best case scenario for them to me was to be competing for playoffs. So already I'm just going to mention that they hit my expectations, the peak of my expectations, and I'm very happy with the team. But it's weird when you look back at some of these matches, without any context, you just see the series result. It's like 2-0 loss against Furia, 2-0 win against Movie Star, 2-0 win against Eternal Fire, 2-0 loss to Liquid, and 2-0 loss to Cloud9. It's like, so they got 2-0'd by every team that is better than them, and they 2-0'd every team that they, with the best expectations in mind, should have been beating 2-0. The caliber of the organization, they should be beating those teams 2-0. It's kind of funny when you look at it like that because that is definitely not how this group stage played out. It was a very, very interesting group stage in the sense that, after the first 2 days, like they were playing the toughest two teams in the group, Cloud9 and Liquid, and in those four matches, the four maps that they played, they only looked competitive on one map, and it was the very first map on Inferno against Cloud9. That was the only map that they looked competitive on. Cloud9 washed them in the next map. Liquid washed them in a 2-0 pretty easily. And it didn't look very good, and I was actually extremely worried going into the series against Eternal Fire, because Eternal Fire is they've been grinding a lot recently. And they look like they have some serious firepower. Xantares has been on point, and I was very, very worried for how the roster would do against Eternal Fire, but they 2-0'd them convincingly, and then they 2-0'd Movie Star Riders convincingly, and then today they lost in a very close 2-0 series to Furia. The scores it may not seem the closest when you look at it and you see that they picked Overpass, EG picked Overpass, they lost 16-11. Furia picked Nuke, and Evil Geniuses lost Nuke 16-12. And but I would say really what it came down to, this both series, what they came down to? Anti-ecos and force buys. Dude, the amount of anti-ecos that were lost from Evil Genius's perspective was mental. It was every anti-eco, it felt like. Literally, like, the amount of times where Evil Geniuses would put themselves in the perfect position to start stringing multiple rounds in a row and would fail to do so because they lost a round that they should have won because they were playing against a bunch of pistols was mental. It was mental. Because if there's one thing that Evil Geniuses is, or two things that Evil Geniuses is really good at, they're good at pistol rounds and they're good at force buys. They're good at those two things in particular. They're very good at those. But the problem is, it's really great and all that you can win a force buy, but in the subsequent round, when you have the money to have better utility and weapons than your opponent, because your opponent just got beaten by a force buy and they have no money, you kind of have to win an anti-eco round. If you don't win that, what was the point of winning the force buy? So that seemed to be the issue. A few key rounds like that going the way of Furia meant that they lost the series 2-0. I actually took a lot of crap for a tweet that I made where yesterday, so Saturday, I made a tweet saying that I was impressed with EG. I was happy. I was already satisfied with how they've performed. They beat all the teams I wanted them to beat. They lost to the teams that I expected them to lose to, and that I hoped that the series against Furia was close. And if they beat Furia, they had an opportunity to really show people that EG is actually like a team that can deal some damage, because Furia is no joke, and that but overall I would just have to wait and see, and we'll see what they can do. I ended up getting a bunch of Furia fans replying to me, just retweeting, just reposting that exact tweet that I tweeted, and trying to meme me for some reason, as if like I had insulted Furia or something, even though I literally said their team was good and competent. Like, I don't understand that, but whatever. It was a close 2-0 series overall. I think this could have been a 2-0 in Evil Genius's favor, honestly. They just, on Overpass, it was neck and neck the whole way. They had actually just won a key, crucial round into screwing over Furia's money, and then they lost the anti-eco, and the game just ended from there. And it would have actually put them in a really good position. They probably would have won the map. And a similar story for Nuke, where they just couldn't string enough CT rounds together because they kept losing, anti-ecos, and it just ended up being a disaster, honestly. Um, it was bittersweet. It was bittersweet. Not a disaster. I mean, obviously there were good things there. I think Evil Geniuses overall has a lot to be happy about. But it's just bittersweet because you definitely could have beaten Furia and maybe even made playoffs. They wouldn't have really done anything in playoffs, but just making playoffs if you're Evil Geniuses is like winning the freaking major at this point, considering how bad the last 2 years have been. Obviously that's an exaggeration, but you understand my point. But we can talk about a potential map pool here. So from all the games that I watched, which I watched all of them, I get the sense that Overpass is like, that is your map. Like, Overpass is got to be like like one of, if not your number one option. Screw it. It should be your number one option. Inferno should not be your number one option, and here's why. Inferno should never be any team's number one option, because Inferno is a map that everybody plays. And why is that a bad thing if that's your first, if you want that to be your first pick? That's a problem because every team is pretty competent on Inferno, which means you have a better chance of losing that map against them, right? And then if that is the case, then you're going into your opponent's map pick, which is probably a map that you're not as comfortable as they are. So yeah, it's just from a strategical standpoint, it's not smart to have Inferno, a map that everyone plays, as your primary map pick. So I'm glad that they went with Overpass. I'm glad they started picking Overpass more often, because I didn't like when they were picking Inferno first, because that just screams to me that you just don't feel confident in any other map right now, and so you're just like, screw it, we practiced Inferno because everyone plays Inferno, so we're going to play Inferno. Like, that's what that screams to me. So I'm glad that they started picking Overpass and they started recognizing that that's a map that every player really seems to enjoy. Nealon likes to call on it. Automatic seems to like it as a rifler. And Cirque has always liked it. The players just tend to like Overpass, and so I think that, and they seem to be naturally pretty good at it. So I'm glad that they went with Overpass. Overpass is a strong map for them. Nuke is another map that I think they're actually pretty decent at. At least their T sides are actually relatively promising. Their CT side needs some work in the sense of, again, they need to win their anti-ecos because you can't be affording to slip up on rounds on your CT side of Nuke because you're just giving your opposition too many chances to end up closing out on their CT side if they're the team that picked it, in which case Furia, that was the case with Furia. Man, it's a lot of talking. But yeah, so Nuke seems to be a potential option. Dust 2. I don't really know how I stand on Dust 2. I think I'm not a massive fan of their Dust 2. I know they kind of dominated against, I believe it was one of the either Eternal Fire or Movie Star Riders. They played one of the two teams on Dust 2 and they dominated them. But they got absolutely owned by Liquid and by Cloud9 on Dust 2. And frankly, Dust 2 is a map that, I don't mean to say this in a bad way, but it kind of just comes down to individual skill. At some point, like if both teams are strategically competent, it kind of just comes down to who's gonna out aim the opponent. And I think it was just a really poor decision to go into Dust 2 against teams like Cloud9 and Team Liquid, which are teams that their rosters have been together for a decent amount of time. So they have the structure and cohesion, plus they just have better fragging. Axile and Shiro is too much for you to handle and at the moment with this new roster of EG. And Team Liquid has Yakindar, who is just going to entry everybody in the face. So, like, it just didn't really make much sense to me for them to pick Dust 2 as often as it kind of got played. And Eternal Fire, I think, tried to kind of punish pick by picking Dust 2, but it didn't work for them because they're not Cloud9 and Liquid. So I'm not a massive fan of their Dust 2 at the moment. I need to see some considerable improvement, and I expect people to pick Dust 2 or try to get it to Dust 2 more often than not. Mirage, I haven't seen a lot of Mirage recently. I think the last time we saw Mirage was at Blast. No, last time we saw it was in the RMR open qualifier. I actually think their Mirage might be a sleeper pick. I'm not gonna lie, we haven't seen it much, but I think it might be a sleeper pick. I actually expected to see this map with Furia, but it didn't end up happening. Although it would have happened, it actually would have been the third map. I mean, let me get this. I'm going to say it right now. I actually think that Evil Geniuses messed up their veto against Furia at the very end. I liked it up until the 5th round where they removed Ancient. I actually think they should have kept Ancient in because I think Furia would have then removed Ancient, and that way you're making Furia have to decide between you're making them have to decide between only basically it's either Ancient or it's what I think Evil Geniuses should have done. I think Evil Geniuses should have banned Mirage because Furia is a really good Mirage team. So I think that what they should have done is they should have banned out Mirage, and that way Furia then has to decide between Inferno and Ancient, and I think they're much more likely to pick Inferno than Ancient. And I think Evil Geniuses is a much better Inferno team than they are a Mirage team. So that is my logic as to why I think they messed up the veto, and I think they should have actually banned. I think they should have actually banned Mirage instead of banning Ancient. I think they messed that up. But that's besides the point. The point is in terms of the map pool, I think Vertigo is probably I haven't seen much of Vertigo. I don't think they're going to want to play. Yeah, they've removed Vertigo in this series. I think it might actually be a permaban for them. They seem to like Overpass. They seem to like Nuke. Ancient doesn't seem like a map they're totally on board with, but not many teams are. Inferno they like. Mirage they like as well. So I think the maps that you're going to want to see Evil Geniuses develop on because they seem to like them and you want these to become their best maps are Overpass, Nuke, and Inferno, and Mirage. Those 4 maps, I think, are maps that they're targeting to be their strongest maps. I think the ones that are on the fence are I think they wanted Dust 2 to be like that, but I don't really feel very confident in that. I think that should be taken a little bit, move that down the totem pole. I think that should be like right under Mirage. And then you've got Vertigo and Ancient, which I think they're not massive fans of, with Vertigo being at the very bottom and Ancient being just above that. That's kind of how I see EG's map pool at the moment. Yeah. Uh, let's see here. What else did I want to say? There was something that was on the top of my mind that I just can't, or tip of my tongue that I can't think of now, and it's kind of bothering me. Um, maybe it'll come to me in a second. I'll just try to keep talking and maybe it'll come back to me because it's not coming to me right now. Um, oh, player performance. I'll touch on that. Um, we saw great signs from Breezy. Breezy looks like he can play. I think Breezy has kind of redeemed himself. Honestly, he had a really bad series against Furia, but I think overall, for the ESL group, I think he's shown that he can still play. He can still compete, right? Um, oh, I remember now what I was going to talk about, and it kind of relates to this. I'll talk about it right after. It deals with EG's playstyle. What do I think EG's playstyle is? But I'll get into that right after I get into talk about the individual player performances for the group. I think Breezy has shown that he can play. I think Automatic actually had a very weak pro league overall, which was strange. I really thought he was going to be the consistent force. He really has been the past couple of months or so, and so that was shocking to me. He had one good series against Movistar, but everywhere else just seemed like he underperformed, frankly. So that's strange. I hope that changes in the RMR. I don't. I hope that that does not continue. I don't expect it to. I think this was just an off event for him, but still worth pointing out. I think he had an off event, and I think if he performed better, there's a chance. I don't want to nitpick. Screw that. I'm not gonna nitpick like that. But yeah, he underperformed a little bit this event. I think that's fair to say. Breezy performed relatively okay. He had some good series, some bad series. Hexed, he's still young. He's got more time, right? I think when EG's winning and EG's playing well, Hex seems to perform well. When EG's not really doing too well, Hex is a little bit lower on the scoreboard, but I think that's expected. It's a new roster. There's so much that he has to learn and get caught up with in terms of the. I mean, I don't know. Maybe not as much, but he's just he needs time. He needs time. Okay. Um, so yeah, he was okay, right? He did okay. Nealon was very good actually this event. Very very strong event for Nealon. Yeah, love to see it. I'll talk about the calling a little bit in a second when I talk about their playstyle. But in terms of his performances, like yeah, he had some bad performances, but he also had good performances. And when it's your in-game leader, you expect, he had some performances that you would love to see from a lot of in-game leaders. So Nealon, I think, played pretty well. Cirque has played really badly this event. He played a good last series against Furia, mostly a good last map, I think. I don't know that his overpass was. Yeah, his overpass was terrible. But his nuke was really good. Or at least it started really good. He kind of fell off at the end. But he had a good map, kind of. Kind of. I don't even know, man. Like, Cirque has been really underperforming, and I hate to say it because it's just like, I just want him to be good, man. He was literally like my favorite player. He literally was my favorite player. I loved Cirque when he was on his freaking peak, man, in like 2018. Uh, I loved Cirque, man, and I still do. Like he's such a great person, and I know he has a good work ethic, and that's why it pains me to see him perform so poorly all the time. Because I just like it's like you can't even hate him because he's literally just trying his absolute best, and he just can't seem to do it. Again, we'll see. I think if he doesn't start performing by the end of the major, and if they don't qualify for the fall final through the showdown and the major ends and everything, and Cirque is still really underperforming, I think you have no choice but to get rid of him and replace him with either an international opper, which I think is going to get a lot of scrutiny if they do that because they're not picking up a player from within the project, the Blueprint project. But on top of that, I mean you'd have to pick up like Wiz or Pone Alone, which I hope it ends up being Wiz, but it could also be Pone Alone. I don't know. Um, but yeah, it's sad to say, but Cirque really just isn't performing. But Breezy has been, which has been great to see. Breezy has proven that he can perform at a tier one type of level, And so that is always good to see, which I always thought was the case. I always feel like Breezy's aim is incredible. It's just they're not setting him up properly because their team is so bad and dysfunctional. So now that their team's starting to get some structure, I think it makes sense for Breezy's form to come back up a little bit. So hopefully that continues going into the RMR, which is what I'm going to talk about next. Oh, no, it's not. Playstyle. EG's playstyle. Real quick, here's what I thought besides losing on anti-ecos. This is what I thought EG struggled with on their T side. I'm going to focus on the T side because I think the CT side mainly just comes down to they would actually have strong CT sides, but it just comes down to losing anti-egos. Which I think actually I'll briefly mention. I think that comes down to not having enough like mini setups where you have like a bait setup between two players, and you've got like two. It just feels like a lot of times they're losing these anti-ecos because a player is just getting caught off guard by themselves. When in reality, what should be happening is, you want if someone's doing something somewhat aggressive or is, on their, you want them in a pack. You want like groups of two with one guy kind of like sure he's on his own, but he's playing a little bit more conservatively, right? And so that's kind of how I see it, right? And I think that's kind of the problem right now is they don't have many like good like little mini idea setups on their CT sides that they can kind of go into to work together and be able to take down multiple opponents at once. I think that's a problem not just for their anti-ecos, but it also is a problem for like for their gun rounds. I think a lot of the times they get through their matches by just somebody having a strong individual play, and I think that's kind of not a very consistent way to play. So I think that's something they need to work on with their CT side. But it also kind of moves into the T side, which is that I think they kind of get bailed out sometimes by a player. Just again, they take some map control, and they basically what Evil Geniuses does in their playstyle is they make sure that you have no friggin' clue what they're doing. Like if you play conservatively against Evil Geniuses on your CT side, you will probably lose every frickin' round and you will have no idea what they're doing because EG takes some map control and then they just cut noise for like the rest of the round, and then at the end of the round they won't even execute. They'll just kind of like start walking into the site and taking duels. And so if you're not on the CT side, pushing for information, you're going to get caught off by Evil Geniuses. You're never going to know where they're going to hit until the last second. Um, but I think where it has obvious problems is when the CT side does start aggressing. And I think that's what was really, you could see that was the crux of the issue a lot of the time was you would see like somebody would be lurking on overpass on at long, but then and the rest of the team would be like at B, and the long guy just kind of gets caught off guard by a two-man push from the CT side on the A side of the map, and then next thing you know, everyone knows, hey, it's going B, so you just stack your team at B. I just think like too many times when this team is sitting around kind of cutting noise, they just get caught off by an aggressive push by an opposing CT player, and it just ruins everything. And you have rounds that like dude, I mean, they just fall apart. You rarely see executes from Evil Geniuses. They almost never have like a 5-man, like just nades all over the place type of execute. Like that almost never happens. At most, it's like a couple smokes, maybe a Molotov and a flash, and you just see them kind of going into the site. But you don't really see any like set executes or anything after they've cut noise. And it just feels like when CT sides really start aggressing, on their CT sides, it becomes really difficult for Evil Geniuses to. They're not always fully aware of what is being exposed and what needs to be covered while they're just cutting noise. So, while I do think it was definitely catching teams off guard with their play style, I think at the same time, it was definitely also hurting them as well. And which is why I thought I was worried Furia was going to just blow Evil Geniuses out of the water because I knew that Furia was going to be aggressive on their CT side. And it made me worry about them being able to pick up T rounds, when they're trying to cut noise and they're just getting caught off by aggressive pushes from the CTs that are coordinated. Not to mention, I don't know that EG does the best job on flashing off oppers and taking map control like very um, with a lot of consideration for where people could be in the sense of flashing off angles when they peek angles and molotoving angles and taking map control by using utility. They sometimes, in an effort to try to keep some of that utility for the execute, they'll mismanage it a little bit in the early round and potentially just get picked off by an op for free with like some dude peeks an angle with no flashbang and just dies, and you're just like, okay, well, there was no flashbang, there was no trade opportunity, like it was just kind of a wasted, moment in general. Um, so yeah, I have some issues with how Evil Geniuses play, but overall, I think it's been a good thing. It's a completely different style of play than it is the CIS style of play, and so I think it catches teams off guard, which is good. But I do worry about their consistency and kind of clearing up some of those issues because it seems like sometimes they just get caught off guard from CT pushes, and on CT side they sometimes they don't really do many like, hey, we don't have any information on going on the map, so we're gonna do like a two-man push into overpass water, and the third guy is gonna be in like heaven or something. He's gonna flash us in, and we're gonna try to take that map control. Like that almost never happens. Or like a two-man push in bathrooms, at the later in the round, right? That almost never happens. They kind of just jump spot from the back of the site. And I'm using overpass as the example because it's the immediate one that comes to mind when I'm thinking of the maps they like to play and whatnot. But I think it applies to pretty much every single map that they play. You see these same issues. So I'm just pointing out the issues just to point them out. But I like not to say again like there's nothing good that comes with it. I think they catch a lot of teams off guard with the way they play, and I think it's a very unique style of play that as long as they enjoy playing it, I think it's actually like a pretty interesting. It's a nice style to have overall. Especially now you just got to perfect it, right? So yeah, that's kind of what I wanted to talk about there. How good is Evil Geniuses? Are they going to make the major? Oh my goodness, this episode is an hour and 39 minutes long. I want to die. I'm just kidding. That's not the case. um, okay. Now that we've seen Pro League, will this team make it to the major? My answer in short is yes, they will. I think this team is good enough to make the major. If we look at the overview of the teams going to be competing in this RMR, I think Evil Geniuses, I'm only going to be looking at some of the top teams here. I think Evil Geniuses are, let's list my ranking now for them, right? Going into the RMR, I think Fury is the top dog, if not Liquid. One of those two is top dog. I think Complexity is probably the third best team in that list. I think after that, you're looking at potentially, let's see, maybe a Pain Gaming sneaks up there. But honestly, I really think Evil Geniuses might actually just be the fourth best team, third to fourth best team in the RMR now that we've seen them play Pro League. I think they're better than Nouns and Pain and MIBR and Zero Zero Nation and 9Z, Oplano, Arctic, Acerus, ATK. They've beaten ATK. They've beaten Team 1, I think. Yeah, they beat Team 1. They beat ATK. They're obviously better than Infinity. They're obviously better than Isurus and Arctic. I think they're better than Oplano and 9Z. Um, I think they're better than a lot of these teams. I think they definitely should make the major now. My worries have been quelled a bit. Obviously, we still want to see them perform. The only thing I'm worried about is, guys, the first team that they are playing has been released, and they are going to be playing against Nouns as their first opponent, which is not good because Nouns is pretty good, and I actually expect them to be one of the teams to make the bottom end of the slots to go to the major. So that kind of sucks. Um, because you really want to have a really good first day. And when you look at someone like Liquid who's playing Team 1, you're like, I kind of would have rather had Team 1, although Team 1 is a little bit dangerous, not going to lie. But Fury is playing Infinity, so, like, I would have wanted that matchup any day of the week. Yeah, so an unfortunate pairing here, playing against Nouns, although Complexity also doesn't really get that much better of a matchup. They have to play ATK. So overall, all the NA teams, just the top NA teams, just getting screwed over with their first matches of best of ones. So that could get dangerous because now you're looking at a world where, like, okay, well, let's say like Team Liquid gets upset and loses to Team 1 in a best of one. Evil Geniuses loses to Nouns in a best of one in an upset. Oh my gosh, Team Liquid is playing Evil Geniuses in their second best of one, and now you're looking at an Evil Geniuses that's probably going to go down 0-2, and have to fight all the way back up from the bottom. Like, you don't want that to happen. So I'm nervous. This system, this format is really bad, and it scares me. So I think this team is good enough to make the major. I think they're probably the fourth best team, coming into this, but that is not a guarantee, right? That is not a guarantee. So we will see. But I think they are good enough, and I think this team has made considerable progress, and I hope they continue to make progress this week, and they really grind for it. Um, and overall, I'm very happy with how the team has been playing. I'm happy with where the team is going. I have been talking for an hour and 43 minutes now, so I'm going to wrap this up. Oh, jeez, I'm going to need timestamps for this. You guys are not going to be able to watch all this. with everything being said, with everything being said, I'm very happy with where Evil Geniuses is. I think they're moving in the right direction. I think the Blueprint project deserves more clarification. I think League of Legends Worlds is going to be hopefully good. I think they're going to get through the play-in and potentially go to a group, and maybe they even perform well because I think Kaori's a good player, Cowrie's a good player, and his playstyle works for this roster. I think Valorant franchising is good. I worry about the roster because the roster is probably going to change because the best player in the world is on the market. In summary, I'm looking forward to a very, very busy next couple of weeks with Evil Geniuses. I hope you all enjoyed. You guys don't have to listen to me anymore. Thank you for watching. I hope you listen in next week as well. And yeah, uh, live evil. I'm happy. I'm excited. Lots of things going on. So stay tuned. Stay tuned for what is to come.